75% pass rate in white UK candidates, only 42.7 in international graduates. And then I linked this article to talk about how great of an issue it is. And then I talked about cognitive load theory, which is basically the instructional theory, which posits your working memory, being limited in space, must be wisely used to allow maximum knowledge gain into your long-term memory, which is theoretically unlimited. So that was where cognitive load theory came. And extraneous cognitive load is basically a subtype which says the amount of working memory would be reduced, the amount of knowledge you gain would be reduced if, due to poor design of teaching material, or the learners made to perform task irrelevant activities. I quickly showed this slide, which is basically the information in the previous slide, but as you can see, it's highlighted, it's coloured, it's in different fonts. There's a picture of Mickey Mouse, which obviously distracts people from what exactly I'm trying to tell you guys about. So, high the exchange cognitive load, lower the amount that's learned. And then that's where I'm thinking about differential attainment and exchange cognitive load. And I talked about the causes, which was international students perceive racial abuse, learning second language, adapting to a new culture. It contributes to that negative emotions as extraneous cognitive load. So yeah, that was where I was like, this is what I want to do, is see if there is a reliable measure to measure extraneous cognitive load. So if I'm able to measure, find out, okay, actually perceived racial abuse is a major issue, rather than actually learning a second language. Therefore, I'm going to use this information to actually bring up solutions, identify these are some strategies we can do to address that, and see what is exactly the causes of it. And that's why we need a universal reliable measure, which I couldn't find in the literature. That's why I did the scoping review to find if there was indeed a universal reliable measure. That's why I came to the conclusion that Lepping's cognitive load scale, because it was quite in different settings, it's been tried by 36% of all the papers I included in my review. It's quite a robust scale with the addition of an extraneous cognitive load to measure negative emotions. It's because of the context of international medical students. But yeah, the take-home message, the main one I really wanted to emphasize on was obviously this has to lead to something to make an actual impact in the real world. And that's why we got in contact with collection colleagues who are really happy to work with us on this and actually add the negative emotion subscales to the Lepping's cognitive load scale and try it on their medical students and also university medical students and see how we can actually cater to their needs. And we also got funding from them, so we're just happy ending this. Yeah.
Great summary.
Thank you.
Do you have time for questions?
Yes.
Yes, we do. Yes, please.
How would you fit the literature on things like burnout, resilience, well-being, etc., into this framework?
Could you repeat that question? So, could you just repeat that question, please?
Oh, well,
How would you include
at least,
burnout?
so I'm US based.
Yes.
There's considerable literature on, I'll just limit it to burnout.
Okay.
And wondering how the whole burnout literature or frame might fit within either cognitive load or ECL.
Thank you. That's just after you repeated that, made more sense. So, how does it fit into the context? That's exactly what I'm trying to find. To see, for example, is it the fact that this person's overworking themselves that's causing the poor performance by burnout, for example, or is it the fact that they have social economic factors that's affecting them, or is it that it's the perceived racial abuse? To find out which factors exactly affect them by using this scale, and say, you know what, actually, perceived racial abuse isn't that much of an issue for that particular person. It's actually the fact that they're burning themselves out by studying too much because of whatever reasons they might have. And seeing, okay, so that's what we have to address, that's the root issue, as opposed to blindly providing the person with pastoral support because we have a general consensus that there's racial abuse that they might be facing. So it's a bit more systematic in that approach so that we can devote our resources to the right audience. Yes, please.
Thank you.
Oh, any of these?
Lucy, I'm mostly aware piece from you. So I guess inferring from that, would it be correct in saying that there is a bias in the learning ability that you have that if you're receiving racial abuse, which I would assume is a negative emotional response, does that then prohibit you from being able to expand your cognitive bandwidth to then manage the load? Is that what we're trying to do?
That's a really good question, and that brings us to the point I couldn't fit in my actual presentation. It brings us to the point why I think negative emotions contribute to extraneous cognitive load.
Yeah.
I think this might answer this. It's not, again, the evidence is not concrete, but it's really suggestive of the emotions that of the role that emotions play in performance of a student. Negative emotions such as anxiety, stress, and stuff of that sort actually bring down a person's performance, whereas in the contrast, positive emotions do elevate the performance of a student. So that definitely talks about how. So that definitely adds validity to the project.
A lot of the IMGs that I've worked with have said that it's not just the culture, it's not just the system, it's also biases in terms of when they are coming to train in the UK. There is a thought that any previous clinical experience that they have cannot be transferred or is not valid, and therefore they feel like all of their experiences have just been completely, they're just obsolete, and I think that also contributes to how it's being abused.
Just to add to that, I'm myself an international student, and me personally, I wouldn't say I have much about any drop in performance as much regarding to perceived racial abuse or something, but that's a personal testimony. I would say it's more of strive to achieve, strive to improve myself at that sort of point, and obviously that testimony changes with different medical students. Collecting that testimony would give an insight into what actually causes it, and having that idea, we could go off that actually to actually see, okay, these might be the sources of extraneous cognitive load, let's measure all of them. So yeah, thank you very much.
Can I just ask a
Yes.
question?
No, you go.
I was going to, it's really interesting, your work, and actually, just going back to the gentleman about the US, there's been a lot of data from the US from Richard Williams' work around the effects of discrimination on health outcomes. And so I think it'd be really interesting to also understand whether there's a paradigm, because discrimination, as we know, it is not just about abuse, there's about a whole piece around belonging, around exclusion, around microaggression, around, it's very different from perhaps what you would associate with racial abuse or overt harassment, which is again different. So I think because there's been a clear link between physical health outcomes and discrimination, there's also a likely huge link between mental health outcomes and probably cognitive load as well. And I think it'd be really interesting to actually tease out and understand the differences. And do you have, from reading around in your literature review, a sense of how different types of negative emotions might impact on the cognitive load scale?
Thank you for your question. That's actually a really good question, because it's quite hard to actually find a reliable measure of negative emotions.
Exactly.
So I talk about in my paper that this started in 1995, for example, in the UK, for example, when differential attainment was first reported, and they tried measuring cognitive load by using all sorts of measures. So they started using pulse rates. They started using fMRI, and they started using measures such as eye tracking measures when doing secondary tasks, when they see images that might produce negative emotions. But it's just so hard to delineate. For example, even these subjective measures, really cheap to perform, have got lots of good results. But the problem is, if they performed in a simulated setting, you might delete all the unknown sources of extraneous cognitive load you might see in a real life setting, and that's something I talk about. So I understand the reason why it's not been successful so far, because of the fact that it's quite hard to map all the sources of extraneous cognitive load. And what we're planning on doing, as I told you with that colleague, is to find out with testimonies from students what exactly is causing it, and if we have a source of these are the sources of negative emotions, these are the physical health issues that is causing this disparity in performance, then we can actually use this tool and measure all of those. But yeah, it's quite hard to actually map negative emotions and how they affect, but we are trying to make an effort.
Thanks. Mine was just a question about you adding the negative emotions to an already established scale, but what were the questions in Lepping's scale?
Actually, it's been used, negative emotions, in another scale by another person that used Lepping's cognitive load scale. And what they did was, they didn't measure negative emotions explicitly, but the context of the scale was in a lecture room theatre, use of mobile devices during a lecture theatre, and how, like, distractions that they might cause, and distractions cause extreme cognitive load, and noises in a lecture theatre. So they used the cognitive load scale by Lepping. They couldn't actually get any positive results. They couldn't map everything. It was really poor results. So then they added a specific subscale of, okay, can you tell me how exactly this noise or distractions from messages from your phones